Hey, it's Armin with Attract. At Attract Advisors, we offer accounting advisory, tax advisory, as well as financial management services. We're lucky enough to work with very many hardworking, talented entrepreneurs across many different industries. Many of these individuals are world-class in their sphere and have great stories to tell. This is our way of highlighting their accomplishments and their insights, and we hope you enjoy these conversations.
Hey guys, welcome back to the next episode of Kickin Assets. Today I'm joined by what's become a family friend, Dr. Alan Coulter. Alan, thank you for being here. How are you doing today?
You know what? I'm doing great. This is going to be fun, right?
Indeed. It's not every day that, I'm really introduced to somebody just a few minutes prior to, the interview. I think that I've been told that you and I have a lot in common, and, I'm a big fan of folks with high energy and folks who make a difference. I think all qualities of which, apply to you.
Well, thank you very much. But, commonalities is a great way to get started, trying to find out exactly what you have in common with somebody else. So that's a good thing. Good.
Yes, indeed. So let's start at the beginning, Alan. Talk about kind of your upbringing, your early childhood, and really through adolescence. And, I hear that you've attended a university that is not LSU. So I'm interested to hear more about that.
Well, okay, so let's start at the beginning. So, I was born and raised in Texas, which, automatically gives you a built-in ego.
Yes.
And so, my grandfather was a sharecropper on my dad's side. My dad had a fifth grade education. My mother had a little bit of college, maybe a semester, something like that. So to have a son that gets a PhD, is a little bit of overachieving. And, so for me, but I'm proud of the fact that, from generation to generation to generation, we can improve. And so, if in fact I modeled that for my children, that's really what I'm interested in. And I think all of us are probably interested in that. So born and raised in Texas, as I said, and pretty much lower middle class upbringing. We weren't poor, but we had to make it every month. It was like always kind of a little bit of a struggle. A certain amount of anxiety. So did that, and then pretty much I've worked since the age of 14. Still working in my 8th decade. Work brings meaning. And it's an important part, I think, of every person's life. I mean, that's why I think a lot of people struggle, for instance, with retirement, because if their work was part of their identity, which if we're doing a good job in organizations, we build that identity for people, then when they don't have that identity anymore, what are they going to pick up as an identity? So it's something, especially for entrepreneurs to think about, because if their identity is in part embedded in what they are developing, even when, for instance, they sell out and move on to something else, they've got an issue of, who the heck am I now? And that's why you see serial entrepreneurs, I think, is because that's where they found their meaning. So they look on for the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. So with me, I have 4 children. I have 6 grandchildren. I have 12 great-grandchildren. And, I'm very much invested in my family and in their progress. And so, I try, once again, I'm trying to model for them the fact that, gee whiz, we all need to stay fit. We need to stay alive in our thinking. We need to surround ourselves with people that can influence us. I mean, I know you're familiar with, you really are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. So, be careful about who you pick to hang out with, because inevitably, that influences you no matter what you think about it. So, let's see, I went my bachelor's and master's degrees. I have a double master's in experimental and school psychology. and from University of North Texas, and a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, which gives me, and everybody in my family went to LSU. So I always root for Texas when they play LSU. I always root for Texas in the first half and LSU in the second half. And that's been kind of a family value. So now that we've got the LSU UT kind of thing out of the way, what's next?
Yeah, so growing up in a family that, again, didn't produce a bunch of PhDs, what was it in your early life that really drew you to pursue, advanced degrees and to pursue psychology, as a whole?
Well, that's good. So the expectation of my family was that I'd go to college. Knowing that my dad had a fifth grade education, came out of World War II on the GI Bill, went to a Dale Carnegie class, and so he was a traveling salesman all his life. Then became a barbecue chef when he retired because he couldn't stand being retired. So I went to college. My first bachelor's degree major was business because I wanted to be wealthy. Mm-hmm. Well, I had to put that aside, as I reflect back on my career. I didn't quite achieve that. But wealth gets defined in lots of different ways. Mm. And my wealth really is in my family and in the people that I interact with. That to me, I feel very wealthy in that regard. Rest of, the finance piece of it, I do okay, and that's fine, but I'm not as acquisitional around wealth in the traditional sense. So I started out in business, first in marketing, then in personnel management. In personnel management, I took a couple of psychology classes, really liked psychology. So I wound up graduating with a bachelor's degree with a minor in psychology, but immediately went to graduate school in psychology. Very interested in experimental psychology. The only problem is you can't do squat with a degree in experimental psychology as far as a master's is concerned. So before I got out, I realized, because I was holding down two jobs and going to graduate school at the same time, what the heck was I going to do with this master's degree? So I switched to clinical and got what amounts to a double master's, and then I interned in public schools. And so I kind of drifted into school stuff, but I've always been much more interested in how systems work and how organizations kind of operate in terms of their structures and their processes. And so throughout my career, I've taken my psychology piece, but there's a branch of psychology called organizational development. And that's really what I enjoy doing. I do, like leadership coaching teams, that sort of thing. A lot of it is in schools, primarily now for me in state agencies, because they are doubly challenged by not really working directly with kids, but needing to influence what happens with kids. So I get really interested in teams that need to influence other teams that influence other teams. So that's how I drifted. And so, I come out of the University of Texas at Austin with a PhD in what amounts to educational psychology, but really my focus has always been on organizations, how things can be effective, and how to use data to sort of support all of that, which, as you and I will get into, is also how I think personal skills, personal knowledge, et cetera, really needs to be much more data oriented. And we've got the tools now to really make us fanatical about it,
yes,
in a positive kind of way.
That's right. So one thing that really interested me as kind of hearing your story is, you touched on your dad kind of coming off of World War II. And I, over the last couple of years, have really dug into what life was like in the United States, primarily in the early 1900s, with Rockefeller still going strong, and then, kind of moving into like the 50s and 60s where GE was real big. I just read this book called Power Failure about the rise and fall of GE.
Yep.
And I'm very interested to hear your take on, and it's a deep question, but of the evolution of American society really coming off of World War II to kind of like where we are today. Because so much, it sounds like, of what you do is dealing with organizational development, which is personalities and characteristics and traits and habits that, all of these decision makers have or need to have. And what's it been like for you with such a, like, what I would say is a golden era, right? Coming off of World War II, of, booming economy and just like America as a superpower to, really moving to where we are today.
So, well, first of all, as an aside, since that's one of your interests, you really need to listen to the Founders Podcast.
Okay.
Because this fellow does a very nice job of researching an early entrepreneur and basically describing in 2 to 3 hours of these podcasts how that corporation kind of came to being. And remember, corporations legally are people.
Yeah.
So if you stop and think about it, everything that we do is modeled on human behavior, on people, and really the evolution of Homo sapiens. And so let's go back to World War II. So, my dad comes out of World War II like thousands and thousands of other, mostly males, come back to the GI Bill and trying to figure out what are they going to do with their lives now that they're not in conflict, and obviously women had stepped up. Now women had to submerge themselves. And so we went through a period of 30, 40 years where it took us a long time to recognize again that women are really equal partners in that kind of workforce, organizational, operations. So, as I said, my dad had a 5th grade education. Mm-hmm. What's he going to do with that? Well, he went into sales, and he would take me to work with him, and I would watch because I was a kid, elementary school, that sort of thing, and you learn a lot by observing other people, right? So I would see how he interacted with folks. And while I don't do sales and really don't want to ever do sales, but nonetheless, that interaction of trying to meet somebody else's, first of all, detect what their needs were, and then find a way to meet those needs, that is something that we have done for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you go back to hunter-gatherers, as a small group, we worked together to identify each other's needs. We figured out how to cooperate and collaborate on things. And so, the idea that the golden age, so to speak, is different in every generation. And so, I agree, there was a golden age in the 50s, primarily because we pushed lots of guys into the workforce that, hadn't been there before or had to transform themselves. And then, we've had golden ages ever since. Mm-hmm. I think we're in another golden age, where, for instance, now people are trying to figure out how to live with technology in a way that doesn't raise their anxiety, threaten, their identity, et cetera, et cetera. So, we're going to, in the next 5 to 10 years, the way in which we interact with technology is going to completely transform probably, 90% of the jobs that we have. Mm. So, I like this golden age concept that you have, but I see it throughout the history of humankind.
Mm-hmm. And, you look back and how the U.S. has performed and, how before then it was, Great Britain, and then before then it was the Dutch, and now you've got kind of the rise of the Chinese economy and these other superpowers who are coming up. But yet, the wealth has continued to grow in the U.S. The quality of life has continued to grow in the U.S. And so, maybe I am a little bit cynical of, kind of some of the more recency biases around political and ethical things that they've got going on these days. And so take me back to getting involved in organizational development. We've hired basically coaches, implementers, things of that help our company. What was really like your first break into that? And how were you able to build trust with that first client, knowing that you hadn't done it before, or maybe them knowing that you hadn't done it before?
Well, part of, remember, my generation. So, a lot of the investment in credibility among people that are maybe 40, 50, 60 years old is really around academics. So the fact that I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Louisiana, you walk in with a certain amount of built-in credibility that if you don't screw up, you can ride on that for a while. These days, with younger people, that's not particularly, that doesn't establish your credibility. It's really more around what your performance is and how do you quickly sort of summarize and demonstrate your performance with somebody else. But for any kind of leadership coaching relationship, the first thing you need to do is to, in fact, build that trust. Because if the person doesn't trust you, credibility opens the door, but you can't even walk through that door without beginning to sort of establish a certain level of risk-taking, a certain level of being vulnerable yourself. God knows, I've got still a lot to learn. That's one of the things I enjoy most is just learning new stuff. And so, being able to exchange and reciprocate is really, for me, the most important part. And then also to listen. Can you tell I like to talk? Is to listen, and make certain that you are hearing what the other person is saying. Because we all know, we all talk, but that's not necessarily what other people hear.
And so you mentioned kind of the shift in where, years or decades ago, licenses and credibility was kind of built in with, advanced degrees and again, certain certifications. And it's meaningful to me because, I have a CPA license.
Right.
And when you were talking about that, it was really, kind of like in my brain saying, oh, well, that's really how I was able to build, credibility in the first place. But what do you make of the fact that, a advanced degree or a certain certification is maybe a little less regarded now than it used to be? And is that more of a microcosm of how you think the American society is viewing education as a whole?
Well, I think, once again, attainment, when attainment is measured by certifications, by pieces of paper, so to speak, that say, well, you did this, that I think is what's has lost a lot of credibility. I think attainment from the standpoint of being able to establish results, to have a track record, to be able to say, this is what I accomplished, et cetera, or this is what working with other people I could accomplish. That really now it's much more the level of credibility. Licenses, et cetera, are really modes of convenience. It's like when you go to the physician, what we've learned is, well, the doctor told me this. Well, now we know because we have much more information available to us, much more accessible, et cetera. You begin to question what you're being told. And so, and we all trade information about, well, who's this particular doctor and is he any good, and that sort of thing. My youngest daughter's a registered nurse. So one of the things I always do is I ask her, have you heard of this doctor? Et cetera, et cetera. I actually now have a couple of physicians that are really good friends of mine. And so I'll say, tell me about this person, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of trading of information is not around what's your degree, what's your license, but it's more along what's your performance. And, you're very protective of your CPA license. I'm very protective of my psychology license. And what I find is that in my interactions with those boards, they all say they are to protect the public. And in many instances, they do work very hard, I think, in many instances, especially board members, to protect the public. But really, it's a guild. It's a group of people who have a common identity, but they also are very protective, and competitive, with anybody else coming from the outside. So, for instance, in the delivery of services, mental health services, we really began only with physicians. Then psychologists sort of got into the game. Social workers got into the game. And so then we had basically physicians, psychologists, social workers, then nurses got into mental health, et cetera. And as those additional groups came in, you see the guilds really getting quite threatened and trying to settle in. So if you stop and think about CPAs, think also about the advance of artificial intelligence, applications. To what extent do you really need, that CPA degree? I mean, I had an uncle who came out of World War II. He was a licensed pilot. He had a lot of bookkeeping experiences. He invented an accounting system that basically was like punch cards where you'd run a rod through to pull particular accounts out, et cetera, et cetera. It was very, very clever, but he couldn't sell it until he went back to school and got his CPA license. Then all of a sudden he had credibility, even though the idea that he'd had nothing to do really with his academic preparation. As I say, I think that's shifted. And I think especially as we move forward more and more, the access to information that the general public has lends them in a position to where they regard expertise differently. Expertise is really more like, what can you do for me that works for me, as opposed to, what do you think I should do? So, sometimes we followed advice of an expert and said to ourselves, oh my gosh, that led me down the wrong path. And then what did that you typically conclude? Not only concluded that person wasn't particularly helpful, but in many instances you concluded that profession wasn't particularly helpful. And I think that generalization is an error, but unfortunately it's a phenomena that we have to all cope with.
So with I could tell you're passionate about many things. I think you're quite passionate about your family, and you're quite passionate about education, or at least the advancements in education and AI and things of that nature. And so I have 3 daughters, 6 years old, 4 and 2, and I have a son on the way. He'll be here any week now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I'll have 4 children. And a lot like you, I love to read. I love to explore new ideas. And I'm really curious to get your thoughts on the traditional American education system. And from early childhood learning all the way through high school, given the fact that you have multiple great-grandchildren yourself at this point, like how are you, if you were asked by your family members, how would you advise on schooling?
Well, we have tried for over 100 years to improve public education. I mean, in the United States in particular, we really have been extraordinarily generous and very ambitious about making certain that that our children get access to education. I mean, if you think about the Boston Common School, which was really established to educate immigrants, because people with wealth at that time, they had no problem. They'd hired tutors, et cetera. So then you couldn't necessarily, with an immigrant child, especially people, poor, had almost no resources, they couldn't afford a tutor. So public education really got created to educate kids in groups. So there's 2 really good outcomes that come from educating kids in groups. Number one, they all learn how to get along with each other, how to cooperate, et cetera, how to compete, effectively. And then they also get content information. If you only got your information from a tutor and you were sort of tutored alone or maybe with one or two others, you lose that social piece. But you get a lot of intensive academic content if the tutor is effective, obviously. So what we've done is we've tried to improve the effectiveness of that group sort of learning situation, in part because that's what we could afford. I mean, to educate large numbers of people is very, very expensive unless you can figure out economies of scale in one way or another. So kindergarten through 12th grade, even that structure comes from the Prussian army. Because in Prussia, the army, which pretty much ran the society, needed to educate the males so that they would be more effective soldiers when they got of age to become soldiers. So stop and think. Now, that's the way in which we're educating our kids today. Okay, so that particular set of efficiencies probably isn't going to work as we move forward. So technology, one of the promises of technology, now bear in mind, technology's been in public education for about the last 40, 50 years, and it's been a dismal failure, in part because people don't know how to use it effectively, in part because the technology itself was relatively primitive. As it improves over time, we're going to be able to do personalized learning. And once we become much more effective in our assessment of what kids need, then we're going to be able to apply much more effectively than how to meet those needs. Much like medicine is trying to move now from what's called medicine 2.0, which is what's wrong with you, to medicine 3.0, which is really much more personalized, which is like not just what's wrong with you, but how can you actually improve? How can you optimize what's called your health span as opposed to your lifespan? The difference between health span and lifespan is it's not how long you live, it's how long you can function effectively and not be miserable at the last 10 years of your life. So, that kind of personalization is not just in public education, it's really going to be in large parts of everybody's lives. So right now, education's really suffering, in part because its credibility is so bad. So while everybody says education is important, it's just lip service. For most people that are working today that have kids in school, they say, gee whiz, I've escaped the expense of health care. So of child care. For yourself, you've got child care issues until they get to public school. When they get to public school, you breathe a sigh of relief and you say, gee whiz, now the kids are getting taken care of. In many instances, we're paying less attention to those indicators of whether or not kids are actually learning what we think they should learn, and more attention to just simply getting relief from the expense of childcare between the ages of about 5 and 17, 18, something like that. So I think you're going to see, as we start to see more results, you're going to see much more of a personalization piece. Now, we've tried, especially in the state of Louisiana, we've tried charter schools. We thought charter schools were the answer. Well, once again, you've replicated the same design. You simply have taken the public piece out of it and put the charter school emphasis in it, which was much more trying to localize, control, et cetera, et cetera. But guess what? We've got good charter schools, we've got excellent charter schools, and we've got dismal, failing charter schools, the same way in public education. So when you look, especially nationally, when you look at the performance of the two different organizational models, they really come out to be about the same. There's really no superior model. Now, that's going to upset a lot of people in charter schools because, sometimes, they've invested their money in it. But you got to look at the data. And that's really where I encourage parents to pay much closer attention to data. The other thing that we know is that despite all of our efforts, despite all the money that we've spent, et cetera, social class has a much better predictor of a child's educational performance than anything else. Not respecting, the fact that, yes, teachers can be highly influential. So, I could ask you the question, give me the name of one or two teachers that you thought really influenced you, et cetera. Almost everybody can come up with that person. Okay? But unfortunately, that's one or two or three teachers out of maybe 100 by the time you get through high school. Maybe more than that by the time you get through, let's say, a bachelor's degree. So it's the organizational development piece that I think is going to change radically in public education. But we're going to have to get to a point where technology can enable it much more cheaply than what we're paying for now. Because really, public education, the money we put into public education, 90% of it goes for people, just to pay people.
And I mean, that's a nice segue into the organizational development piece, because, we've talked about the economics of education and how it's just simply so expensive. And, I've never really thought about it like that, but it's so true. And I mean, it explains why teachers are underpaid and those sorts of things. When you're looking at organizational development, an organization is obviously a collection of people. And, in my business or our business at Attract, it's like, we want the best players on the team. The best players are often the most expensive. And, talent mixed with structure and goals and culture is really what, makes you successful. So how will organizational development play into a scenario of education, in this case, where the deck is almost stacked against you from a financial perspective?
Well, I think, number one, people, for the most part, we all believe that people work for money. That's really what motivates folks. Money's not unimportant, but money's not the most important thing. There are probably, estimates vary, but a large majority of people are working in jobs that they hate. And if you hate your job, you're not going to be effective. You're not going to do as good as you could in a situation where you really think, that this is good work for me. So stop and think. Organizations are made up of people. So if I take it down to the person level, there's three things that you really want to pay attention to for every individual. Number one, does the purpose of that job fit with the overall purpose that that person thinks that they should have in their life? Secondly, does that person perceive that in that particular job that they matter? That in fact what is going on with them and their performances is that they really matter. That if they weren't there, they'd be missed. That if they weren't there, the organization wouldn't click quite as efficiently. And then third, does the person's perception of what's going on, does it have coherence with their meaning in life, their value system, et cetera? So where people are in jobs that they understand the purpose and adopt it, where in fact they know that they matter because they're getting that kind of feedback, and that feedback then feeds, so to speak, their motivation. And then third, that what they're doing really does make sense to them as something that's meaningful, all right? So that's at the individual level. So now let's take it up a notch. When you look at the organization needs to say to themselves, what's our stated purpose? What's our vision? What is it that we think we are doing, okay? And does it align with our values? Is this really good stuff that we do? And then, do we matter? Are we really making an effect? Are we good at what we do? And then does it really fit within the needs of the broader society? So you can look at Baton Rouge, you can look at Louisiana, you can look at the United States in general. Organizations need to ask themselves the question: are we really coherent? Do we really fit within what our nation and the population that we are a part of matter? That in fact it fits. So that's the piece that I think is really important. So you can Go back to public education. Why is it that so many teachers stay in the job of teaching? Because they're not getting good money, So they're saying to themselves, but you know what? I'm really making a difference. It fits within my purpose of I really want to build, better society. So I'm going to get the kids, where I can influence that piece. Does it fit within my values over time? Is my job coherent with really where I want to be as a person? Yes, it is. So then you put up with the less money because all the other things fit. So when organizations really click, they're paying very careful attention to those three big ideas and trying to make certain that things work.
And so over the years, I know you mentioned you're in your 8th decade now, and you've been doing organizational development for a long time.
Yep.
What's it been like from a personality and a culture perspective from when you started doing this type of work to maybe what it is today? From dealing with technology and dealing with the sentiment of, there's that saying that says that that hard times create hard men create soft times, and soft times create soft men, and then soft men create hard times. It's just a loop.
Right.
How is it? Have you seen that play out in your years in coaching leaders and teams?
It's not a damn bit different.
That's good, I think.
In 2025 than it was when I started in 1969. The factors of what makes an organization work well versus what makes an organization not work well, or, from a psychological perspective, using the old disease model, there are organizations that are sick, that aren't doing very well. And quite frankly, they go through periods. Some of them are no longer in business. Right? You can look at lots and lots, Kodak, et cetera, where people didn't take advantage of changing circumstances. But they didn't take advantage of it because they were problematic as an organization from the get-go. So for me, things haven't changed. You still have to be extremely explicit about what your purpose is. You need to have a good, clear vision, not in the sense that you have this elaborate, long-range plan, because as we've known for a long time, the minute a plan gets finished, it's out of date. Dwight Eisenhower once said, in planning for D-Day, the planning was everything, and once D-Day was launched, the plan was worthless. But it was all the preparation that went up to it that allowed them then to modify and advance different kinds of things. If you think about SEALs, Navy SEALs today, they spend a lot of time planning, but they know once the plan gets initiated, things are going to change. The circumstances always change. So you want to make certain that the organization has a vision, but really focuses on what I call short cycle planning. I look at organizations, what's your 30 days? What's your 60 days? What's your 90 days? That's as far as you need to plan for certain kinds of things because circumstances are always going to change. So yeah, we've introduced technology, but guess what? We've had technology, for a long time. When you put a buggy whip together, at the turn of the century, there was technology involved in putting that buggy whip together. But the idea is that even as you incorporate more and more sophisticated technology, it's still human beings working together and trying to communicate and make certain that they're paying attention to the right metrics. Because in many instances, the right metrics really tell you whether or not things are working or not working for you. So, I'll pick on you, John.
All right.
So CPAs like to look at the bottom line, so they look at cash flow. They look at, what's debits and credits, et cetera, et cetera. And granted, those are useful metrics, but those aren't the only metrics, as you well know, that ought to tell you whether or not things are working well. And so it's really having a broad range of measures that allow you to tell whether or not things are working, and more importantly, where the challenges are. And then on those challenges, to use your metrics as a way to say, when I do this intervention, when I do something differently, et cetera, is my metric going to change? And you're constantly tweaking those metrics and looking at them. Much like now, as you well know, profit and loss has changed in its definition over probably the last 50, 60 years of accounting, because the way in which it gets defined becomes much different. You got taxation, you got other kinds of, you got sheltering and money, you got, tax loss initiatives, and lots and lots of things to change that. But nonetheless, for me, it's really around having a broad sense of metrics, because, I'm looking at you and what you're wearing today, and I can tell, you probably worked out this morning, et cetera, et cetera. What are your metrics, you see, for looking at how well you're doing? I mean, I am much more interested in physicians that serve me now as looking at wellness as opposed to disease or illness, because the wellness metrics are much more important to me. If I pay attention to the wellness metrics, the disease metrics really don't come into play, or at least not very often. So, once again, that's, to me, it's the human beings, because it's not just your human being at work, your human being in all the different contexts in which they find themselves.
So what do you make of, the evolution of leaders over time, right? Because, every organization needs a leader. A leader is a person. And I love looking back at, some of the leaders we've discussed earlier, Rockefeller and, Jack from GE and Jack Welch and just all of these like amazing CEOs who, over time just made a significant difference. So much of that, when I think about those founders, and even, I've read the Walter Isaacson biographies of Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, and these are all, high performers, and they track their personal metrics just like they track their business metrics. And so, what do you make of the fact that there seems to be an avatar of successful CEOs that is mind, body, spirit? How can you have a CEO who might not be able to recognize that it's still important to be, physically healthy and to be spiritually healthy? Is that something that you work on with some of your clients? And what's that experience been like for you?
Well, so all the names that you've given me, okay, are good representations of what we call selection bias, because we've chosen to take a look at those people primarily because of some narrow definition of what success and achievement is.
True.
Okay. And so, and then we look at how they came up, and we think that that's the model that other people should use. So let's take Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. Okay. So his biography is, all right, so he comes up in a family. He goes to an expensive liberal arts college, but drops out. Moves back home, lives with his parents, starts to build a computer company in a garage, and treats everybody like crap.
Yep.
And which, by the way, is not entirely true, but nonetheless, that's the characterization. And so now, is that a model that we want any leader to follow? Absolutely not. Okay, I could do Jack Welch, of course, but Jack Welch is a now documented failure as it relates to, leadership style, et cetera.
Yeah.
What I think we all are learning is that leadership is a characteristic, not a role. And so what good leaders do is they build leadership skills in everybody that they work with. Because what we know now is that it's really the teams that pull things together. So if you go back and you look at Apple, you go back and you look at GE, et cetera, it's not that one individual. It's the way in which a group of people came together to manage and put things. So leadership now is much more around collaboration. I think we've all learned that putting the responsibility solely on a person at the top of an organization is really an inappropriate application, because that person simply is the lightning rod for any kind of attention. But there's lots and lots of other things that are going on. And so in those other things that are going on, those are all operated by people. And when an organization is really functioning smoothly, leadership gets distributed. Because you can't pay attention. I mean, you're familiar with the term micromanage. Micromanage is obviously, nobody wants to micromanage. Well, guess what? When they do, typically organizations don't do as well. So it's really more around investing, as you said, in the talent of people, et cetera, and helping to grow a large number of people who do very, very well. That then creates the kind of effective organization.
So, being in your eighth generation and quite fit yourself. I mean, we were talking off camera about, kind of your habits and how important, health and fitness and wellness is to you. Can you kind of take me through if that's something that's always been important to you, and how'd you handle it when you were maybe in college, and then a young man with young children, and then moving through till now grandchildren and great grandchildren? Like, what did that journey of fitness look like for you?
We're all a work in progress.
Yeah.
I've fallen off the wagon much more than I've been on the wagon. And the older that I've gotten, the more important it's become to me, because I really want to stick around as long as I am, healthy. And so, I spend much more time now on fitness than I did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, et cetera. I'm much more attuned to measures, like I get blood work done every 3 months, because I want to know. Insurance will pay for it twice a year at my age, but those other two measuring periods become really important to me. I know more now about my blood measures than I ever knew, 10, 15 years ago. I sometimes irritate my physician colleagues, but nonetheless, they're patient with me because they know I'm well-meaning as it amounts to, really what I'm trying to interpret. So they correct me, which I appreciate. I like to be educated. Sometimes I tell them about things, that they haven't paid attention to, because nobody can really know it all as it relates to your physical health. The other part of it is I'm a psychologist, right? So mental health interacts, because there is no such thing as a mind-body distinction. Those two things are inextricably related. And so there's no real separation between mind and body. There's no real separation between mind, body, and spirit. They all are integrated. And you can separate them out in terms of different kinds of treatment strategies, but when you implement that strategy, it's going to have an effect across the board with all of those things. So, I think right now it's very important for people to get good measures of what's happening. And in those measures of what's happening with themselves, then they can use those measures, those numbers, to then, once again, do evidence-informed interventions, the kinds of things like, for instance, we now know, the only thing that really, really has evidence to improve overall health in the later years is exercise. And so, you can take supplements. I mean, I take 32 pills a day, okay? I get into arguments with my internist over, should I really be taking that, et cetera, et cetera. But, I switch. I'll try, now I'm on a broccoli, supplement, so to speak. It's like, what? Where'd that come from? Well, I saw some evidence and I'm going to try it. The other thing that applies to all of us is individual differences. Human beings, while we all share, a similar kind of genetic profile, et cetera, the individual differences that we have across human beings is so great that in many instances what works for a group of people over here does not work for the same group of people over there. what works for one person doesn't work for the other person. That's what makes, quite frankly, fitness so challenging, is because in many instances, body types, routines, et cetera, all have to be personalized or individualized. So we're all I'm on a journey, like you are, John, about what works for me, what doesn't work for me. Oh, gee whiz, my hip flexors were really talking to me this morning when I was up doing my 30 minutes of outdoor walking. Why was I walking outdoors? Because I needed to get the body, There's all kinds of strategies that you use. So, I wear 3 different body measuring devices on me at all times. As you saw, my water bottle is a Hydrate Spark. It tracks my hydration, gives me reports to my phone, also puts it on the internet, et cetera, so I can compare. It talks to Apple Health, tells me what my hydration was. My Aura Ring tracks my sleep. I have a bed that's a Pod 5 bed that's embedded with sensors. I get a report every morning on my sleep efficiency, my deep sleep, versus other types of sleep. All those things become important, but they're only important if you pay attention to them and use them to act differently day to day, which comes to the point that you didn't want to make certain that we neglected, and that's time management.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So ask your question about time management, because I want to get with you on that.
So off camera, we're talking about, as high performers, I was having this conversation actually this morning with my gym partner about time management, and I have an Outlook calendar that I live by, and that, pretty much anybody in our company can book. And, folks ask me, how do I stay organized? Well, I just do what's on the calendar.
Right.
Yet there are things that are on the calendar that get bumped, like blood work, like a dentist appointment, like a haircut. And so, I know that you have a lot of experience in working with folks who are productive. I like to use the word productive as opposed to busy, but who are productive. And, I was curious as to how do you advise and coach on time management for a very productive individual?
So, first of all, it's not time management. It's really attention management. That Outlook calendar tells you what to pay attention to, okay? If you don't manage your attention, then guess what? Time gets quote unquote wasted. So it's much more around making certain that you have good alignment of your priorities with what you're paying attention to. What you're paying attention to then structures your time. So, for instance, you're right. People can put stuff on your calendar. Well, I will say to somebody, I can do that. Send me an invite. That invite goes to my Gmail account, which then goes into my Google Calendar. And I do live by that. But here's 2 fallacies in that. Number 1, whatever gets allocated for time, in many instances, if you start to change things around, it's because your priorities have changed. Okay? How you were setting up what you want to pay attention to. So the fact that you didn't get your blood work done means that wasn't as important as some of these other things that were happening. So you have to pay attention to your attention. That's number 1. Number 2 is you stop to think about it. You also want to box in the time that it takes to get things done. So time boxing now has become, quite common. So you say, I think it's going to take 2 hours to get this done. Well, that then provokes what's called a thinking bias, because we always underestimate the time that something's going to take in the short run. And we always overestimate how long, over a long period of time, it's going to take to get something done. So whenever you time box, you need to say to yourself, you'll develop your own norm with this, but for me, when I time box something, I figure I'm probably about 30% off. So I need to increase that another 30% and go in and put that in the box. Then once again, in that box, are you attending only to getting that thing done? Because there really is no such thing as productivity equaling multitasking. When you're multitasking, you are much less proficient at anything you do. And we know that attention span as measured, I mean, it's an imperfect measure, but it's a measure. Attention span has shrunk over time. So now we know that pretty much the average is you can attend to something about 14 to 20 seconds, and then you start to shift. Part of that is because we all pay too much attention to the technology around us. I mean, my watch vibrates, my phone, lights up, et cetera, et cetera. You got, I noticed that, you have a person at the front desk who's got 3 screens. Mm-hmm. How do you pay attention to 3 screens when, so once again, managing attention is much more elemental and effective than trying to manage time. Let the time conform to what you want to pay attention to, and then be intentional about how you pay attention.
That's good. That's so good. I'm tying that back into like organizational development too, like with the scorecards, right? Because
Yes.
we're tracking and you mentioned it earlier. I mean, at Attract, one of the things that we like to say is that we measure quantitative data, so financial information,
right.
But also with qualitative data. How many screw ups did we have last week? Right. What are the customer satisfaction roles that net
Yes.
promoter scores and things of that nature. And so when you're dealing with scorecards and figuring out what items to track for certain organizations. How much of that is driven by what given that you've been doing this for a long time and you've helped out a lot of organizations, versus what the organization thinks is important?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to ask yourself, where did these metrics come from? And if the people that are involved in the organization are not involved in developing what the scorecard is, what the metrics are going to be, you're going to neglect things. Number one. Number two, a lot of what is qualitative can in fact be quantified, but it's a lot of trouble to measure those things. So even customer satisfaction, which is a nice, large, broad category, but how do you measure it? What are the factors, and then how do you quantify that particular measure? So those aspects, I mean, you really have to, when you look at an organization's scorecard, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, where did this come from? Who picked these particular metrics? Okay. And when you look at industry standards, to what extent does that match industry standards? And is it also covering the human element? Because a lot of what happens is in scorecards is there's no scorecard for employee wellness. And so employee wellness, once again, goes back to those issues of, is what I'm doing in my job, do I agree with the purpose? Does it have meaning for me? Is it coherent? Does it really fit in with what's going on? Those we can measure. We can do that if we pay attention. But more importantly, when you measure it, if you simply measure it and report it, then people stop counting it as valid. You've got to act on those measures. And so as you act on those measures, then they invest more meaning into giving you good metrics for what's going on. So, scorecards are, that's one way to look at it. The other thing is that you said the word screw up. Okay? There are no screw ups. That's a negative valence on a learning opportunity.
Yeah, lessons learned.
That's right.
Yeah.
When things fail, it's really much more important than when things work. Because things work, well, fine, keep doing it. But when something fails, that's great.
Yeah.
We celebrate that. So because we want to look at it, we want to turn it inside out, upside down, et cetera, and figure out, okay, how did this happen? And what could we do differently, to ensure that it doesn't happen again? Or was that really an opportunity? Could we expand what we do based upon what we learned from this particular failure, so to speak? So failure for me becomes something that we celebrate. We say, oh man, this is great. Let's figure out now what's going on. That's a totally different way. And I have to tell you, I have to work on my self-talk all the time, because when I don't do something, I'll say, well, you stupid, you're ignorant, blah, 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 blah. That doesn't help.
Yeah.
Instead, what you say is, what did I learn from this? Well, nothing yet, because I really haven't stopped, taken a careful look at it, broken it down, et cetera, and tried to rethink it. Have I talked to a colleague about this? Because once again, we all are, terribly flawed human beings. So, if it's dependent upon only on us, we've made a big mistake. So in organizations, that's why I said the leader really, to the extent that they distribute leadership and make it a characteristic of everybody, it also helps when those quote unquote failures occur, because then everybody gets invested in trying to figure out what's going wrong and how can we do differently, as opposed to one person being in charge, because quite frankly, the person in charge, the people that work for them can say, he or she screwed up. It wasn't me, and when you're in the blame game, as opposed to the barrier, problem, challenge, analysis kind of game, that's a no-win situation. The organization is not going to get any better.
And I love what you said about self-talk too. I have a personal development executive coach named Dominic Luke, and he's a former paratroopsman, veteran, and owns a yoga studio. So he's very into like mind, body, spirit, like we've talked about earlier. And he's coached me up on a few things. Number one, he tells me that I shouldn't talk about what I should have done differently. I could have done something differently, because should has kind of a negative connotation that says that your outcome was negative and needs to be corrected. Well, yeah, it was negative. It does need to be corrected, but there's also a semblance of like looking forward for what's going to happen next positively that you're not including in that analysis. So he says, say I could have done this instead of should. You shouldn't should all over yourself. And then the second thing that he's talked to me about as of late is, I've talked to him about my youngest daughter and, going into her terrible twos. He says, teachable twos.
That's right.
Like they're teachable twos. Let your daughter understand that, it's a teachable moment. And, I think being self-aware enough to correct yourself on that and just to try something new, really, I think sets the tone for being open-minded, all the things that we've talked about up to this point. So I'm curious for you, you've always had an open mind. Your fitness journey's adjusting, your priorities, between family's always been a priority for you, but, we've talked about the clinical physician or psychologist side and the organizational development side. And so, what has kind of been your way of continuing to fill your cup so that you could be so versatile yet so consistent over time, whether it's books or podcasts or friendships or mentors or any of those things?
Well, I think you have to be curious. I am part of my attention management is the fact that I get so curious. And so, I really have to work on myself to basically, when I'm paying attention, to make certain that I'm focusing. Because everything that I get curious about leads me to something else I'm curious about, leads me to something else I'm curious about, et cetera. And so, I can run in lots of different directions. I have 2 rooms in my house full of books, okay? Most of those books have never, ever been fully read, because I start in one book and then all of a sudden it leads me to something and then I buy a book about that, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, if you walked in my house, you'd see about 7 or 8 open books, where I'm trying to figure out. And, I'm fine with that. Yeah. I'm fine with that. So I would say to you, what you need to think about is your self-talk never gets examined unless you focus on it. I journal. I love in the morning. When I get up in the morning, first thing, second or third thing I do is, I sit down and I start to write. And the other thing I do is I always structure for myself 3 gratefuls. What are 3 things I'm grateful for? Because in some instances, that also sets a tone that's positive as opposed to negative.
Yes.
And so, do 3 gratefuls. Journal, write at least 3 pages, maybe, just force yourself. Say, I'm going to write for 10 minutes. If you say, well, I have nothing to write about not having anything to write about, because that starts to then surface your self-talk. And then as you go through the day, think about what's that internal conversation. And is that internal conversation problem-focused, in terms of solutions, or problem-focused in terms of blame and guilt? Guilt is in many instances, is a powerful but wasted emotion, And the reason it's wasteful is because you spend time recriminating instead of creating.
Yes.
Okay? And so, we've all been taught, to have guilt. It's a powerful tool for, managing children, et cetera, is to instill guilt. Well, as you said, it's not terrible twos, it's teachable twos, and that age 2 is around trying to establish some independence from that person that you've been, or those people you've been almost 100% dependent upon. And so as you try and figure out, where can I be independent? Because there's always going to be some dependencies. And that, it's trying to test that out. Yes, I can do this myself. Or as my favorite granddaughter used to say to me at the age of 6 or 7, I can hold my own hand. You see? And so, and that person to this day is fiercely independent. And now she's got children of her own. And those children are saying the same thing to her, and when she wants to make certain that she's, doing a good job of parenting, so, hold my hand, et cetera. No. That's where you get age of 2, that's where you start to establish that. So then stop and think about it. Let's go back to organizations. So think about it, John. Everybody that works for you, if you try and tell them everything that they're supposed to do, then guess what? That's a dependency relationship. Most of those people would say to you, if they're psychologically safe, they would say to you, John, I got this. They might also kindly say, why don't you go to the gym and work out a little bit and leave me the hell alone? So, that's, to me, that it's that gentle tension always between different people. And then, once again, as you experience it, are you talking to yourself in a way that allows you to see what's going on and figure out how to make it better the next time?
It's so good. It's so good. Well, as we wrap up, Alan, I think I feel like I'm sitting across myself in 40 years, which I don't mean to date
or
you.
Or maybe 50 or 60 years.
Maybe so. And so it's really, it's such a... I'm so grateful, speaking of, gratitude, to have this opportunity to really take what is, a platform that, is really meant to share with others, but really it fills my cup too, right?
Good.
And so just having the opportunity to meet you and to learn more about, you and what drives you and values and just all things that, later on down the line, I'll be able to look back and say, this is what was important. And it was revealed to me it was important at this time. It's almost like having the answers to the test before you take it. I feel like having conversations like this. And so for that, I'm just super grateful for you. I want to honor you for being here. I really appreciate that.
Well, we started this when I said, let's have fun. Did you have fun?
Yes. Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
I did too.
Awesome.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. That's another episode of Kickin Assets, and we'll see you guys on the next one.